Today's talk is inspired, as usual, by an exhibition. This one was at the Royal Academy in 2019, and it was called Laura Knight, A Working Life. I won't be, what I will be doing is looking at her life and looking at the various subjects that she painted that were covered in the exhibition. The painting you can see here is perhaps her most famous, and I'll talk about it later. She was also known for painting in the theatre, ballet, being a war artist, and she was interested in marginalised communities, the people working in the circus, Romani people, and when she visited America, African Americans. So let's get started with her life. This isn't by her, it's by Harold Knight, who became her husband, and it was painted when she was 14. But going back even further, she wrote in one of her autobiographies, "One of the greatest moments of my mother's life came when she found that I, a mere baby, was never so content as with pencil and paper. Even before I could speak or walk, I drew. There was no question of my purpose in life." Her mother taught art at Nottingham School of Art, and she started painting there. She was the youngest person ever to start at the Nottingham School of Art when she was 14. And when she went, the star pupil there, who was 18 at the time, was Harold Knight. It seems they fell in love immediately. They saw each other, and he painted this painting when she was 14, and they married 12 years later when she was 26 and he was 29. Now, she came from a poor family because her father walked out on them when they were young and left them no financial support. And in fact, it was before she was born, he walked out. So her mother worked part-time at the Nottingham School of Art and always had great plans for Laura. She knew she was going to become a great artist. In fact, her mother told her that she would become a Royal Academician. And this was at a time when no woman had become an academician since the two founding academicians, Angelica Kaufman and Mary Moser. She lived with her two sisters, her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and I think an uncle. And none of them had money. Money was a daily nightmare. But she did have an aunt in France, so her mother arranged for her to stay with her aunt in France when she was 12 to learn more about art, but it was difficult because she didn't speak any French. But she was taught art by a local artist. Now, when she was there, her sister died, so she came back and managed to enter, as I said, the Nottingham School of Art free of charge. Her mother, she helped her mother teach when she was just 14. Her mother became ill with cancer when she was 15 and couldn't teach. And so at 15, Laura took over teaching the class at Nottingham School of Art. And later she won a scholarship and a gold medal. And she was, within a couple of years, left alone with her sister. Her sister had died, her mother had died, and her grandmother died as well. So she moved with her sister and Harold Knight to Staithes in North Yorkshire, which was a small artist colony there. They couldn't afford to pay the models. They paid a few pennies to the children. And she painted in this style, these shadowy, muted tones. And in this painting, it's actually, I believe, her effectively her landlady, Mrs. Bowman, and she stayed with her when she stayed at Staithes. It was actually in Roxbury. She used to walk to Staithes, and she painted this in Mrs. Bowman's kitchen, paying a local child a few pence to sit to create this, a mother and child in a kitchen. So they didn't have much money, but Harold quickly established himself as a successful portrait painter. And so his income funded her early development. And they married in 1903, 4 years after they went to Staithes. and they both decided to dedicate their lives to art. They were very different people. Laura was always outgoing, lively, the life and soul of the party sort of person. Harold was the opposite. He was sober, stable. Some people called him withdrawn and grumpy, but others said that he was a quiet, strong presence in her life. A few years later, they visited Holland and stayed in an artist colony in Laren, which is near Amsterdam, and that enabled them to visit the Rijksmuseum and see Rembrandts and Vermeers and so on. And they painted this between trips to Laren and Yorkshire, and just before they moved from Yorkshire to Cornwall, where things changed completely from this dark, somber mood to this. It had a big impact on her art. Her palette lightened, the dark browns went, and she started painting in this bright impressionistic style. This painting was actually accepted by and exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1909 and was seen as a great success. So she was starting to make a name for herself at this stage. Another painting from this period, which was the following year, which is also exhibited at the Royal Academy. And she, in Cornwall, she became part of the Newlyn School of Painters. Now, the Newlyn School had been there in Newlyn for years. It was founded, essentially, it was founded by Stanhope Forbes who went down there in 1884, so quite a few years previously. And Laura Knight, or Laura and Harold Knight, didn't arrive there until 1907. So it's like a second wave of the Newlyn School. And she arrived with an artist I've mentioned before called Dod Proctor, and they became lifelong friends, Laura and Dod Proctor. Now, she actually moved and stayed in a village called Lamorna, which is it's a few miles down the coast from Newlyn. And there was another artist there, Lamorna Birch, and an artist you might have heard of because he became president of the Royal Academy, Alfred Munnings, was there. In fact, I think I read that Alfred Munnings actually had a crush on Laura Knight, and she had to watch out whenever her husband wasn't there. He would come round, but she managed to fend him off, I think. Now, moving on a few years, 1914, the First World War started, and she did continue to paint on the coast at Newlyn, but there were restrictions. It was illegal to paint in the countryside or on the coast in the First World War. So she did it in a clandestine way, although later she acquired a permit to continue painting the coastline. But she became a war artist, not the British government. She received a commission from the Canadian government to depict their soldiers' training camps. And this one is physical training at Whitley Camp in Surrey. And she painted a number of pictures on commission. And this one is actually in the Canadian War Museum. And I'm also showing it to show that she did actually start painting from essentially from life, the human body, because as a woman artist, she wouldn't have been allowed into life classes at this time. But she painted from life in, for example, here, sketching and painting boxing matches in Surrey. When in Cornwall, this is called the bathing pool, and she hired, what she did here, you can see the women are naked. She hired models from London because the local women didn't want to pose naked, and she was very keen to free herself from the rigidity of, she'd learned to draw the nude, by drawing plaster sculptures. And she found that that had introduced a rigidity into her art, and that meant she felt she was drawing the human body in a very static and stylized way. So she wanted to improve her drawing ability. So she hired models from London. A lot of them were dancers, and she painted the women in the open air on the rocks and cliff tops around Newlyn and Lamorna. There was some criticism from locals, but luckily the landowner, whose name happened to be Colonel Painter with a Y rather than an I, and he supported Laura and other artists and gave them free rein to paint in this way on his property. She painted this in 1912. In fact, the first painting she did of women on cliffs and women bathing was called Daughters of the Sun, but it was damaged and destroyed a few years later. It was shown at the Royal Academy and got a lot of praise, and we have black and white photographs of it. It was in fact very similar to this one, the bathing pool. So rather than showing you the black and white photo, I'd showing you a very similar painting. And she did a number of other paintings of this style of women bathing, but not just women bathing. She also did women on the cliff tops around Newlyn and Lamorna. This one is it's called On the Cliff, Cornwall. And I think what the women are doing is, one is sewing and the other's threading a needle. This one is quite interesting because it was sold at Sotheby's in 2009 for £645,000, which is the highest price to date that's, as far as I can find with my research, that's ever been paid for a painting by Laura Knight. That's just to put it in context. But by the way, the bathing pool was sold in more recently in 2019 for 132,000. And her paintings of the Cornish coast are very popular and attract the highest prices. Incidentally, one of the models she used, an ex-Tiller girl called Dolly Snell, married her husband Harold's brother and became Mrs. Edgar Knight. So she was influenced by this elements of the Impressionist style and elements of the Newlyn school. If you like, trying to imagine a combination of Stanhope Forbes and Monet merged together. She insisted on realism, but her subjects are modern, and she painted later ballet dancers, gypsies, circus performers, but she didn't experiment with abstraction or any, if you like, unusual effects, any isms, cubism, fauvism, and so on. She was inspired to paint landscapes during the Boer War when she was at Staithes. But when she was at Staithes, her a lot of the landscapes she threw away. In fact, she said she burnt them to keep warm, but she learned a lot. And when she was there, she remembers her first view of primroses in the spring, which inspired her. And she said that although she burnt a lot of the landscapes, she did learn a lot. And it all came together in a picture called Spring, this picture we're looking at now, which she painted years later in Cornwall. So this was the culmination of her trials and tribulations in learning to paint the landscape, which she achieved. This is her first, she felt, her first successful landscape painting. In her early paintings, she did always include people, and the people in this one are Ella and Charles Napper. And Ella was an artist, later quite a successful artist and jewellery designer. In fact, she worked with Laura Knight on jewellery design at one stage. And when she painted this, she hadn't yet got a permit, and it was illegal to paint outdoors anywhere in Cornwall. So she said in her autobiography that what she would do is lie under a gorse bush, making quick sketches in fear of being taken off to prison. And then she would rush back to the studio and paint the next section and then repeat. And also in this painting, I don't know why, but after she'd finished it, she changed Charles Napper to a boy. And then it was exhibited for many years in England and internationally with the woman and a boy next to her. And then in Pittsburgh, the painting was destroyed by the acid, smoky atmosphere of the industrial town. And she removed all the varnish and removed some of the paint and decided that the boy was wrong and changed it back to the man again, which is what we see today. So that's a quick, that takes us up to essentially about 1920 and after the First World War. And what I'll do now is I'll look at some of her categories of painting. Each category I'll present sort of chronologically and talk about them, because these are the categories that were in the exhibition that I mentioned, which was called Laura Knight, A Working Life. The first painting I like to talk about is the one I showed you at the beginning, Self-Portrait with Nude, because this is essentially, I think this is probably her most famous painting, the one she's known for, the one that you see most often when people talk about Laura Knight, the one that has been discussed most often. And one of the reasons for that is because of the conflict she had with the art world as a woman artist. She wanted to be an artist irrespective of whether she was male or female, but there were a lot of restrictions on female artists that she was fighting against. And one of the main problems for her, as I've already said, is that women artists couldn't attend life drawing classes. It was beginning to change. They could at the Slade, but not at the Royal Academy, and then it changed at the Royal Academy, and they could, but the models had to be draped or semi-draped. So this, it was a very in-your-face sort of painting that she intentionally did. She did it with two mirrors, by the way, because this is a self-portrait. So she's looking to her right into a mirror at 45 degrees, which is looking or directed at another mirror, which is looking back on the scene, so that she can show this scene of her painting on the canvas on the left, of the model on the right, as if you were coming into the room looking at her, and she's just half turned towards us. So a clever design composition for the painting, but it was too daring for the Royal Academy in 1913, and believe it or not, they rejected it. She was 36 at the time, by the way, so she she'd already shown a number of paintings at the Royal Academy, so she was becoming well known, close to becoming famous, not so much with the public, but within people who followed artists and went to all the Academy exhibitions. And this was seen at the time by critics as a very controversial painting. The Daily Telegraph art critic called it vulgar and added, might quite appropriately have stayed in the artist's studio, was the way the art critic put it. It was exhibited in other galleries. It was shown in Newlyn originally, and then it was shown in other galleries, but as I said, rejected by the Royal Academy. And she continued to exhibit it throughout her career and it continued to receive criticism over a number of years, and it was eventually purchased by the National Portrait Gallery the year of her death, because she didn't sell it in her lifetime. She kept it in the studio, and when she died, her executors sold her work, and it was bought by the National Portrait Gallery for, I seem to remember, £700. It's now considered a key work. And at the time she was criticized. Another criticism is she was criticized for drawing like a man, which I thought was an interesting criticism. And she drew from the shoulder, which is the way you're taught, rather than from the wrist. A final comment on this painting is a much more recent, 2015. Simon Schaumer described this painting as a masterpiece, incomparably her greatest work, all at once conceptually complex, heroically independent, formally ingenious, and lovingly sensual, which I thought was an excellent description by Schaumer. Right, this is, look at the dates. It's 1916 and 1934. The reason for that is that she started this vast painting. Look at the size. It's a couple of 2.5 meters wide. It's a large painting. I'll show you a photograph of her standing next to it in a moment. It's of the artist I briefly mentioned just now, Lamorna Birch. Incidentally, his name was Samuel John Birch, but there was another artist called Birch, and Stanhope Forbes, in fact, suggested he give himself the nickname Lamorna, and it stuck. So he was known from then on as Lamorna Birch, and he exhibited as Lamorna Birch, and he spent his whole life in Lamorna. He bought a house there and stayed there, painted there the rest of his life. This and she painted this with his 2 daughters in Lamorna Valley. She and this was at a time when again painting outside was illegal. She kept the painting unfinished in her studio, but then in 1934 Birch was elected to become a full academician at the Royal Academy, and she finished the painting and exhibited it at the Royal Academy. And here's a picture of her in front of the painting, so you can see the size. She's standing with the a number of, these are academicians. And also I wanted to point out in the background here, just here with the pipe, is her husband. That's Harold Knight. As I said, he was made an Royal Academician this year. Birch is not very well known today, but he was very well known then. He was a very prolific, and in fact, incredibly, I can hardly believe this figure, but I've checked it a few times. He painted 20,000 paintings over his lifetime, 20,000. I did read that he got up before anyone else. He got up before dawn and was down in Lamorna Cove as the sun rose every day. And but it's still an incredible number. This is varnishing day, by the way, before the public came in. And I should have added that I pointed out Harold Knight. He was a man of iron principle as well. I said he was solid and stable, but he was a conscientious objector during the First World War. And so he was assigned duties as a farm labourer and suffered a lot of abuse as a result. Right, 1926, at the end of the First World War, they moved to London. Later, I've got a picture of their London house. Over the next decade, from during the 1920s, she concentrated mostly on painting pictures in the ballet and the circus. She also she worked in a wide range of media. I'm showing you mostly her drawings and her paintings, but she did engravings, lithographs, and so on. And she produced a poster advertising tram travel in Twickenham. And she continued to produce posters for London Transport throughout her life. So she did a wide range of different things, but I'm concentrating on the paintings. And this was regarded as one of the finest portraits of this period. The sitter is a young pianist whose beauty captivated Knight. It's Ethel Bartlett, the name's on the picture. And she was toured Europe and America playing with her husband, who was also a famous pianist. It was shown at the Royal Academy in 1926, and it was this painting that confirmed Knight to be the preeminent painter of women, was the way she was categorized at this stage. So the preeminent painter of portraits of women. So she was becoming well known, although at this stage slightly categorized. And because she was becoming well known, every time she became better known and better known, it freed her painting, and she painted more and more. She took more and more risks with her painting. But in 1922, she went to America, and then again in 1926, with her husband. Harold had received a commission to travel to Baltimore to paint portraits of the surgeons at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. And she went with him, and she became friends with a nurse called Pearl Johnson, and Pearl Johnson took her in to the wards of Johns Hopkins, which were racially segregated. In fact, Johns Hopkins Hospital was opened as a result of the then largest philanthropic bequest in American history, and its mandate was to treat the residents of Baltimore without regard to sex, age, or color. And so it was one of the few leading hospitals in America that actually treated African Americans, but it was still segregated, and the racism was rampant. But Laura Knight focused just on those wards that contained the African American patients, and there were many paintings she did at this time, and this is my favorite, so I'm showing you this one. And she learned about the realities of African American life from becoming friends with the African Americans there. This is 1939, it's called The Gypsy. In the 1930s, she befriended and painted groups of Romanis or gypsies at the Epsom and Ascot racecourse. And she wrote later about this painting. He, a gentleman called Mr. Smith, one wet day at Ivor, Bucks, in the camp there near the railway, posed for me in a little lean-to tent, just a corner in shelter, crowded by a big double bed where an old gypsy and his wife slept. I painted it in 3 or 4 hours. I haven't anything more to say about that Mr. Smith, except that he figures in several other paintings I painted at Ivor. And what happened, she actually got permission to paint at Ivor. She got an introduction, and she became interested in the lives of the Romani people and got to know them quite well. But it was an odd relationship. She didn't expect anything of them. She was accepted by them. She just took them at face value, if you like. She was intrigued by their lives. She enjoyed painting them. She was inspired by them, as she was by circus performers. But for example, she painted them at Epsom from inside her antique Rolls Royce. By this stage, the end of the 1930s. She was an extremely well-known artist and wealthy. She owned an old Rolls Royce, which was big enough to take her easel. So she had an easel up in the Rolls Royce, and she painted them from scenes of the Romani people at Epsom from inside the Rolls Royce. This is my final portrait. From 1933 onwards, her and her husband became regular visitors at the Malvern Festival, which was devoted to putting on modern plays. And during one visit there, she met the patron of the festival, George Bernard Shaw, and they became good friends. And you can see I've included a photograph of them standing together at outside the, I think it was the hotel there. And she stayed at the Mount Pleasant Hotel in Malvern. And there are a number of pictures I haven't included here of views around the Mount Pleasant Hotel. She stayed there every year when the festival happened. And there's now a blue plaque on the hotel commemorating her and the time she spent there. And this takes us up to the Second World War, and I'll cover that a bit later, her painting, because she was commissioned by the War Commission to paint during the Second World War. But first, I wanted to cover her interest in the female nude, which was one of the sections of the exhibition at the Royal Academy. And as I've said, it enabled her to extend her skills into the painting of the human body and get away from the rigidity of painting, drawing from plaster casts, which is what she did at art school when she was at Nottingham School of Art. And as I've already said, she employed later, she had enough money to employ female models, and so she could learn to improve her drawing from then. Mostly, or in fact, I think exclusively female models, by the way, and the only male semi-nudes that she painted were the boxers that I've shown, and she did a number of paintings and drawings of boxers. That was another one of her preferred types of paintings, preferred subjects. Painting from the male nude would have been too controversial. So this is Eileen Mayo, who was an artist and designer who worked in England, then Australia, then on New Zealand. Her early life, and I'm talking now about Eileen Mayo, the woman in here, and I'll explain why in a moment. Her early life was marred with tragedy, and she fell into dire financial circumstances. And in 1927, this was painted in 31, in 1927, she tried to drown herself in the Serpentine, but she was discovered. I don't think she was actually saved, but she was saved from drowning. Laura Knight saw her, and Laura Knight found out more about her, initially employed her as a model, and subsequently, because actually Eileen Mayo was trained at the Slade, and from a beginning, being a model, with Laura Knight's help, she became an established artist. So, in other words, she went from poverty, owning nothing and trying to kill herself, to success almost overnight when she met Laura Knight. And because she was posing for Laura Knight, other artists that Laura Knight knew, her friends, demanded her as a model, and so she posed for Dodd Proctor, Vanessa Bell, Mark Gertler, Duncan Grant. In fact, Duncan Grant described her as his muse. All of these artists were friends of Laura Knight, who was becoming one of the best known and most popular artists at the time. And Eileen Mayo became accepted later as she started to paint. She got exhibited at the Royal Academy. She later in life traveled to Australia. In Australia, she designed the postage stamps. She went on to New Zealand, where she designed some stamps there. So she was both an artist and a designer. And she was eventually made a dame for her services to art in 1994, when she was 87, and she became a dame a week before her death. She died in New Zealand. She was originally born in Norwich. Her mother and sister had emigrated to New Zealand in, I think it was 1921. So anyway, coming back to Laura Knight, this is an important work. Now, Laura Knight, as I've already explained, wasn't a retiring and a quiet person by any means. She was a loud, outgoing, friendly with everybody sort of person. And she campaigned actively and vocally to become the first female Royal Academician. So she didn't sit back quietly to be invited. She was talking to all the artists she knew, saying, look, I'm known by everyone. I'm exhibited at the Royal Academy summer exhibition every year. I should be an academician. Why haven't you made me academician? And she wrote a work criticizing the Royal Academy called Can Women Succeed as Artists? And she, in that, wrote about how difficult it was for women artists, the inequality of opportunity between men and women artists. And she eventually got heard. She incidentally also sort of created a persona around herself with the press. She was very good with the press and at getting publicity. She wasn't demure by any means. So, for example, part of her story to the press was that she knew nothing about domesticity. She said to the press she couldn't even boil an egg. She never got involved with any domestic chores at all. She was an artist. And this work was her diploma work. That is, when you become an academician, you get given a diploma signed by the monarch at the time. And you're in sort of in exchange for the diploma, you give the Royal Academy what's called a diploma work, which the Royal Academy keeps. And this was her diploma work. So she's being contentious here because she's painting two bare-breasted models, and it's a deliberate statement to the Royal Academy that she can do what any other artist can do, male or female. Although she didn't go too far. Note that the women are draped below the waist, so as not to, I think as she put it, to create too overt a challenge to the Royal Academy. And she started to draw. I talked about the models she drew when she was down in Cornwall. She invited them down from London, but about the same time, I think it was 1910, 1911, she started traveling to London to visit the ballet, and she fell in love with the ballet and started to draw dancers in action. So she was sketching movement in action. So she had a lot of more and more opportunities to sketch the human body. And she described her early life drawings as timid, stuttering, labored, but she quickly mastered what she called the perfection of balance and line. in the joy of line for its own sake, the infinite possibilities of composition as exemplified by the human body in movement. And then finally, I had to include this one because within, I mean, she pushed herself forward all the time. She was only the second woman to be made an associate academician and the first woman to be elected as a Royal Academician. As I said, that's a sort of technical point. The two founders of the Royal Academy, Angelica Kaufmann and Mary Moser, weren't elected. So she was the first woman to be elected as a Royal Academician. And that's in 1936. And she was also the first woman to serve on the hanging committee the following year, 1937. And she was asked, and she probably volunteered herself to design the poster. And she's chosen to, this central image is the Venus de Milo, which is in the Louvre, and it's a plaster cast. So what she's saying is she was never allowed, or all she was allowed to draw in the life classes when she was a student was plaster casts like this one. And she wrote in 1936, "The hatred of those plaster cast figures stays with me to this day. I never got any benefit out of their study, and through working from them so much, a woodenness came into my work that took years to eradicate." And she's sort of making that point with this poster for the Royal Academy, teaching them a lesson. Right, in the 1910s, as I said, she traveled from Cornwall up to London to see, it was Sergei Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. And she said, "It gave me the feeling of being born again in a new and glamorous world." So this is one of the works. She did so many, I've had to be very selective. This is a ballerina called Barbara Bonner, described as, quote, "a vital and sparkling young creature who was rehearsing for a show at the time, and many of the sittings had to take place in the early morning." It's an interesting picture. Knight used her own dressmaker, Miss Ferguson. Laura Knight, of course, was not domesticated. She never did any sewing herself. And Miss Ferguson posed as the woman making the alterations to the dress. Laura Knight chose her because her hands and type were perfect, she said. There's no self-conscious artifice. She's caught the dancer sort of mid-glance, arrested or sitting, waiting for her skirt to be mended. And Laura Knight said it was what she called a clever composition, or if you like, a tricky composition. She said it's more difficult to arrange two equally important figures. Notice they're almost exactly the same height, equally than three. And she did this, if you examine it carefully, as two interlacing pyramids. So each person is a pyramid, but notice the arm of the dressmaker. That's what makes it work. That's what links it together. That's what ties these two pyramids together. Otherwise, it would be two separate people. She said she was lucky because from the start to the finish, she got the composition right, and she didn't, unusually, she said she didn't have to make the slightest alterations. One of those lucky paintings that paints themselves without disagreement with the painter. Sometimes she said she felt that the painting started arguing with her and she had to fight back and change it. It was commissioned actually by Hoover of the Hoover family, Earl Hoover, who visited Knight's studio and saw another of her ballet pictures and wanted one, and actually wanted one to include Barbara Bonner, which is how she was commissioned to paint this painting. One of her favorite ballerinas was Anna Pavlova, one of the most famous ballerinas of the time. And she felt her She said, I know every step and gesture in every dance she did. She used to go and watch the ballet at every opportunity. In fact, I think by something like 1912, she was given unlimited access to backstage at the ballet. So she went there whenever she could, from early in the morning to late at night. And these are sketches she did of Anna Pavlova. The one on the left, we don't have the date for all of them. The portrait on the left, though, is 1911, and the one that, well, the curtain call, we don't have a date. The one single standing one, I think, is 1920. So during this period, she often went to the ballet and became sort of part of the establishment. They accepted her there. She was always fascinated by performance and was always sketching. And she became friends with one of the ballerinas there, who allowed her to use her dressing room, which she used to create scenes that she sketched and painted. This actually is not a ballerina. This is Eileen Mayo, again, the one we previously saw in the Maiden, modeling or in the role of a ballerina, posing as a ballerina, painted in 1927. It was ignored. In fact, that's slightly misleading, because the one that was submitted to the Academy in 1927, she painted in a hurry because she had to go and meet Harold in America. Remember, I said she went to America, and the Academy rejected it because they said it was too sketchy. So in 1931, she included it in her American tour. It was damaged during the tour, and so she completely repainted it. And that's what we see here, is the repainted version, which was exhibited at the Academy in 1947. This is the ballerina I mentioned, Lydia Lopakova, a Russian ballerina, who became good friends with her and allowed her to use her dressing room as a studio. What I'm not sure about is whether, I think this is Lydia Lopakova herself posing, and she's, I think Laurinaitis has caught that moment where the ballerina excuse me, is composing herself. She can hear the audience outside, or can hear the orchestra outside, composing herself just before leaving her dressing room to start the performance. Another one of her biographers incidentally said Laura was undoubtedly happiest when painting informal scenes backstage. That's what she loved, the backstage scenes. She painted ballet scenes in the 20s and 30s, the Diaghilev ballet especially. She said that then, during that time, she could be found backstage every show, trying to draw all the wonderful subjects I saw. She said, another quote, "I firmly believe the most valuable study I ever had was in my attempt to draw the ballet. Never before had I tried to make the pencil speak in a language of its own." She also loved the circus. And so I think after the ballet, her best known subject was the circus. And I've got a few pictures here. Around 1920, she visited Bertram Mills Circus in Olympia and fell in love with the atmosphere, and got to know, went backstage and got to know the performers. This was exhibited in 1929, and it's virtually the entire circus cast she painted here. And she, at one stage, she devoted her time to drawing scenes from the daily life under the big top. We'll see one next. She learned to paint because of the speed of the performance. She learned to draw and paint at great speed, and she learned to paint directly onto the canvas at speed without any drawings at all, in order to capture the moment, because the performers didn't have any time to pose. She wanted to capture the moment of the trapeze artist, or the dogs jumping, or the gymnastic activities, or the horse riding as they were doing it. The clown in the center in blue is Whimsical Walker. In fact, we know the names of all the people in it. And these are three of the clowns which she did manage to sketch and paint outside of the big top. And these three clowns became friends of hers. They were Randy, Marber, and Joe Burt. And she wrote, she became circus, accepted in circus, as circus is for good and all. In other words, she became, as with the ballet, I guess she became accepted as someone that everyone expected to see and saw around all the time, and knew, and didn't mean, forgot about. So she could sketch and draw them as they were. I said I need to start going a bit more quickly. As a war artist, this was her most famous painting, so I'll spend a little bit more time on this one. It's called Ruby Loftus Screwing a Breech Ring. She was invited to become a war artist by the War Artists Advisory Committee, and they asked her to paint a picture of a woman working in an ordnance factory in order to encourage female recruits. They were dissatisfied with the number of people that were working in the factories. This is one of the largest oil paintings, and it was exhibited at the Royal Academy, and the next day, this is what made it so famous so quickly, it was reproduced in 8 British newspapers, featured in a Paramount News short film, the ones that used to be shown in cinemas. It was produced as a poster by the War Artists Committee, and it led to a number of other commissions. Now, the interesting thing, I think, is that what she's doing is making a part for a Bofors breech ring, and it was regarded as the most highly skilled job in the factory. And it was normally, when there were outside wartime, the factory was all men, and so this task was normally carried out by men, and it was seen to need some 8 or 9 years training before a man could be given this job. But Loftus, Ruby Loftus, was only 21 at this time, no previous factory experience, picked it up very quickly. She was able, and this was a publicity coup for the factory, for the jobs, and for Ruby Loftus. She became famous herself. Now, you might think that Knight and Loftus were proving that women could be equal to men, but the press and society didn't see it that way. The way they categorized them is that Knight and Loftus were not beacons of gender equality, but they were exceptions, outstanding exceptions, that, if you like, highlighted the limitations of other women. So this wasn't the time, as we know, this wasn't a sort of a breakthrough, but it was a sort of a first step, but only one step. Another commissioned work, she was asked to paint a group of medal-winning women, but she refused. She didn't want them all grouped together. She wanted to paint them individually. And so they agreed, they gave in to her. She was a forceful character. And she painted this portrait of Corporal Robbins, who received a direct hit during an enemy bombardment. Men round her were killed and seriously injured, but she wasn't, and she immediately went to the assistance of the wounded, rendered first aid, helped to get them out of the dugout, fetched a stretcher and so on, and stayed with them. And for this courage and coolness, she received the military medal, and that's why she, Laura Knight, was commissioned to paint this portrait of her. Balloon Site, Coventry was another commission. We see here all women hoisting a barrage balloon outside Coventry, which you can see in the distance. And it was a propaganda tool, again, to recruit women for the balloon command. And Laura Knight wanted and has succeeded in making women, making this job, this work, appear heroic and glamorous. And it was used as as a poster. It was produced as a poster, as were many of her works. Then at the end of the war, she proposed herself to the War Artists Advisory Committee to paint the Nuremberg war crime trials. She must have proposed herself quite forcefully, because they agreed, and she went to Germany in January 1946 and spent 3 months observing the trial. And the result was this large painting, the Nuremberg trial, now in the Imperial War Museum. We see the defendants, they're the ones sitting on the two benches at the back, a line of military police at the back behind them, 2 rows of lawyers in front of them. Now, unusually, and I think uniquely for Knight, she has painted something that symbolic. Look at the back wall. The back wall dissolves away into the rubble and bomb damage of a surrounding city. She was, she painted typically what she saw. She was trained in the Victorian style of painting. She didn't engage in the isms of modern art. And this style here, this symbolic style, conflicted with accurate observation. However, the figures in the front, she was given special access to the broadcasting box, which did actually look directly down on the prisoners like this. So the studies she did from that broadcasting box are accurate studies. So it's the back that she has done from her imagination. She rarely painted from her imagination. She painted what she saw. She was very disturbed by what she heard at the trial, and it affected her after she came back. Which leads into landscapes, which I've already told you about how she burned her early landscapes, but was inspired by Cornwall and had learned to paint landscapes by this stage. She first went to Newlyn. This is Sennan Cove, which she painted in 1922 later, but she was painting landscapes in the early stages of from 1907 onwards, as part of the Newlyn colony there. Now, as I said, she came back to London in 1919, but every summer they went back to West Cornwall. And so this is, she went to Sennan, Lamorna, Mousehole, and other locations. This was painted, this is Sennan Cove. And one of the reasons I'm showing it is it was actually sold last year at Bonham's and it reached just over £500,000, £500,000. So not the most expensive painting, but close to it. And a high price, I think, for a landscape. This is the view from their house. in St. John's Wood. This is where she had the studio. It was 16 Langford Place. It's now got a blue plaque on it. And we see this is Spring. In fact, that's the title, Spring in St. John's Wood. We see the bright green leafy trees swaying. It's a bit windy. It's a spring day. And the picture is full of the activity of people. There's someone coming in her gate carrying what looks like a parcel. There's someone cycling away. There's a couple walking across the road. There's a cat. The man has got a top hat on. There's groups of people walking down the street. I think there's someone in the group on the far right waving up at her. And I think there's someone in a wheelchair there. So she painted this from the window of her house. I think I've got a photograph, yes, from one of the windows at the front of her house. This is the house. Oh, incidentally, the house was on the market recently in 2018. And if you're interested, it was on the market for close on £7 million. So if you're thinking of moving to St. John's Wood, that's what it'll cost you. But this house sold. So you can't actually move into her house. The house she lived in until her death in July 1970, aged 92. The house, incidentally, is one of the oldest. It's got a lot of history to it. It dates from 1770, and it's one of the oldest houses in St. John's Wood. And she painted other scenes of the house and in the back garden. Now, as I mentioned, she was deeply affected by the Nuremberg trials, the Nazi war crimes trials, and she wrote back to Harold, "I am beginning to long for the time to arrive when I have done my work here and can be back with you, Harold, in England." And when she came back, they went together to the Malvern Hills. This is the Malvern Hills, which she loved the landscape there. Notice this landscape, there are no people. And she said that she found it very difficult to forget the horrors that she heard about at the Nuremberg trials, but that nature herself blots it out for a while. When she's painting, it blots out the horrors that she heard about at the trials. Unlike her early Cornish landscapes, as I said, it's populated, and she said because she got increasingly confident and felt confident enough to describe the land on its own, as she put it. And here the sunset fills the painting, and she loved painting mist. And I think I've got one further painting of a misty sunrise is the last painting. I thought I'd end with a dawn. She wrote actually that she got a rage for painting dawn. She got up early and painted the dawn every day, and she loved it. When there was the mist, she described how she could see just the tops of buildings, churches with just the spire with the bottom shrouded in mist. There's so much to say about her life. I thought I'd end with a short summary of she was, some of these things I've said. She was the youngest student to enroll at Nottingham School of Art. She was 13 originally. She was the first woman to be elected Royal Academician in 1936. She was the first woman to have a retrospective exhibition at the Royal Academy. In 1928, she won a silver medal at the Olympic Games. They used to give medals for art in those days. She was the only woman to be given war commissions in both world wars. In 1946, when she was 69, she was the only British artist to cover the Nuremberg trials. She was the first female artist to be made a Dame of the British Empire. And this was at a time when very few awards such as that were given. She wrote 3 books. There were 2 autobiographies, and she wrote a play and was privately a poet, although none of her work has yet been published. She exhibited at the Royal Academy every year from 1903 to the year she died, 67 years of exhibiting, except for 1918 when she was ill and 1922 when she was in America. She exhibited in total 284 works, and she in fact exhibited at the Royal Watercolour Society as well, more than any other artist. And she kept on exhibiting and painting, as I said, up to the year of her death when she was 93. And despite being sneered at by not all, but by many critics, she was extremely popular artist with the public. Although maybe not many people have heard her name these days, at the time she was one of the leading artists, one of the artists in the 20s and 30s that everybody knew about, and the 40s during the war. And she painted more subjects and used more media than most artists. You've seen the range of subjects she painted, but I haven't really shown you all the media. She worked in oils. I haven't shown you many watercolors. This one is painted in oils but painted thinly to actually look like a watercolor, but she painted in watercolors as well. She produced prints, etchings, aquatints, dry point, mezzotint, lino cut, wood cut, lithographs, posters, costume design she did. She designed glassware, ceramics, jewelry, and enamels. I think I've covered enough for now. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for your time.